You can also add a parameterized query right from this window. We can leverage the existing configuration that we've already set in our fill method to create an additional select statement, this time with a parameter. Let's go ahead and do that. We have two ways to do this. We can right-click and select Add Query, or we can go to the toolbox and drag over a query right onto our design surface. Again, this will launch the Table Adapter Query Configuration Wizard. We could use SQL statements, stored procedures, or create new stored procedures as part of our mechanism to access the database. Select Next. Here we have different options on what type of SQL query we'd like to use. We could choose a select that returns multiple rows or a single value. This is when we want to use scalar as our return type. We could also choose to use update or delete or insert methods. We call these CRUD, C-R-U-D, create, retrieve, update, and delete. This is the traditional type of queries you would execute on a data source. In this case, we're going to do a parameterized query to return data. So that makes sense that we choose the select which returns rows. Select Next. As you can see by default, it uses the query that we've already configured in our fill. That way it saves us a lot of time from having to start from scratch. It even uses the grouping name and the order by and anything that we've configured in our default fill statement. Now we want to add a where statement. We can do this directly in this window. Right before the order by statement, type in where, item ID equals, and in order to signify a parameter, you can use the @ symbol. Type in @item ID. Visual Studio is intelligent enough to understand that this query should now turn into a parameter of a particular method. It's always a good idea to use the query builder to check your statement. When you execute the query, it'll prompt you for an item ID. Let's give it an item ID such as 8 and select OK. It will then return any results that happen to match that item ID. In this case, we have none. The query builder is also intelligent enough to tell us if there's any errors in our query execution. If there was an error, we would see an exception dialog box pop up here and let us know that it's unable to execute that particular query. Select OK and select Next. Now we can provide our name for our method. Uncheck the Get Data By, and for Fill By, let's use a name that makes sense to any developers working with our query. As you remember, this query will be now a method that developers will call in order to get data from the database. So let's use a name, Fill Items by Item ID. Select Next, and Finish. Again, notice because of the particular command we used, in this case a select statement that returns multiple rows, the execute mode is reader. And as you can see, the method definition itself accepts a parameter called item ID and uses that to populate the data. Let's create one more data set, and this time we'll choose a different technique. We'll do an insert. Go back to the data source window, select Add, select Next again, and now let's choose the item grouping table. Give it a name, DS Item Grouping. Select Finish. Double-click on the XSD file to launch the designer. Right-click and select Add Query. Select Next. This time, let's choose an insert. Select Next again. Click on the Query Builder. By default, it will automatically select any columns that we can insert into this table. Notice the item grouping is not selected. This is because we have identity seed set on it, meaning that the primary key will automatically generate when a row is added to the table. And notice, any value that we're passing in takes the form of parameters. In this case, we're passing an item ID and grouping ID. This will allow us to associate an item as belonging to a particular group. Select OK, select Next, and now let's give it an intelligent name. Call it Insert Item Grouping and return P key. P key representing primary key. Select Next, and then Finish. Now this is the most important step, the execute mode. In this case, what we want to do is return a primary key, meaning a single value. Let's go ahead and choose the execute mode to be scalar, and then configure our query by right-clicking and selecting Configure to return only the primary key. So instead of doing a select where it returns the entire set of data, let's use a special command called @identity. This will automatically return to us the primary key of the row last added. Why do we want to return the entire row set when all we need to do is use the primary key of the newly added row? Select Finish, and again notice the execute mode changes to non-query because of the nature of the statement. Let's change this to be sure that it's scalar. This is a common source for potential errors, and we want to make sure we highlight this so that when you're working with insert statements or maybe even delete statements, you use the proper execute mode. Again, why return a heavy object such as a reader when all you need is a single set of data? Select Save All to save all your changes. Now that we have some rudimentary data sets available for us to use, let's start configuring our administrative forms.